Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Karen Yarhimilo. I am the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs here at Columbia and the Idley E. Stevenson Professor of International Relations. 2 years ago, this month, Russian forces invaded Ukraine, igniting a war that has destabilized the continent and taken countless lives. A combination of Ukrainian ingenuity, leadership, and determination, as well as Western arms and Russian miscalculations, has prevented Russia from taking the country with military force. But the coming year is truly critical. The war, many argue, has entered a stalemate, with Ukraine in need of manpower, arms, and funding to continue its defense. Today, Russia occupies approximately 18% of Ukraine and has a significant advantage in recruiting capacity and arms production. At the same time, we're seeing growing calls among some Western officials for a diplomatic solution, and shifting domestic politics and pressures are increasingly challenging the nature and scale of financial and military support for Ukraine. The European Union just approved a spending measure to extend aid to Ukraine. And here in the United States, the issue is more contentious. Today, a bipartisan bill is expected to be up for a vote and is unlikely to pass through Congress, and we will talk about this. Furthermore, the future of Ukraine will be on the ballot this fall, this November, when American voters go to the polls. The stakes for Ukraine, for Europe, and the future of the world order could not be higher. That is why the Institute of Global Politics here at Columbia SIPA is kicking off this timely series of events, discussions, and other initiatives devoted to Ukraine, the war, and what comes next. Since the very beginning, our faculty have been actively providing commentary and analysis, as well as helping students, policymakers, and other stakeholders make sense of this complex war. In addition to our in-house scholarly expertise here at SIPA, at Columbia, and the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, and in the IGP, we also are honored to have IGP fellows who are outside experts and leading practitioners with deep experience in the region. We are bringing together both, part of our remarkable lineup of panelists. We're bringing the scholars and the practitioners together to discuss the outlook for the war, the prospects for resolution, and tackling Ukraine's post-war recovery and reconstruction. Before I share an overview of today's program, I'd like to formally recognize some of today's speakers whom we are delighted and honored to have here with us today. Oksana Markarova, Ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, who will be joining us virtually later on today. Masha Jovanovic, who is former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine and Carnegie Distinguished Fellows here at the IGP. And Yevhen Kudriavets, the first Deputy Minister, Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine. Wonderful to have you with us. And of course, I want to recognize my friend and partner in all things IGP, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. As a former Secretary of State, she's intimately familiar with Russia and the region, and since the war began, she has been an outspoken and unwavering advocate for sending weapons and Western aid to Ukraine, and we could not have organized today's event without her support. So thank you, Secretary Clinton. Today's events will focus on three main issues. Our first panel, which I will be moderating, will analyze the military outlook of the war, the effect of domestic politics in the United States, and of course, the larger geopolitical implications of this war. The next panel will address how to handle the fallout from the war. We'll focus on the post-war recovery and reconstruction efforts. And our final session will be a spotlight interview between Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton and Ambassador Oksana Markarova to discuss what's at stake in the debate over U.S. support for Ukraine, the status of the conflict today, and how Ukrainians are thinking about future peace, economic security, and long-term recovery. It is going to be a packed and incredibly engaging afternoon, and I'm really glad that you're with us today. It is now my honor to introduce Minoo Shafik. She is the 20th president of Columbia University, a professor here at SIPA, I will never stop mentioning this, an economist and a policymaker who has spent over 3 decades in leadership roles at major global institutions, including the Bank of England, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and most recently the president of the London School of Economics. It's an honor to have you with us today. Please join me in welcoming President Minoo Shafik.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today for this important event on the future of Ukraine and being held at the Institute for Global Politics at Columbia. Thank you, Karen, for that introduction, to our distinguished panelists, and to our moderator, Secretary Clinton. This institute, led by Dean Yarhimilo and Secretary Clinton, is only in its 4th month of existence. It's hard to believe. And it's already become an indispensable part of Columbia University. Its mission to draw experts from around the world to inform and engage on the most pressing global problems of the day, we always knew that would be essential. But the world just keeps offering up more difficult global politics that need elucidation and understanding, whether it's the violence in Israel and Gaza, or the war in Ukraine, or the many, many other challenges facing our world. If we hadn't created it 4 months ago, we would have had to invent it. So thank you, Karen and Hillary, for being so prescient. And it falls to me to pass the baton to someone who needs no introduction, so I will not waste any time in introducing Secretary Hillary Clinton. But I did want to say she has been an unofficial member of the Columbia community for many years, but this month marks her official 1-year anniversary as a professor of practice at SIPA and a presidential fellow at Columbia World Projects. So happy anniversary. We are thrilled to have you here. And over the last year, you've become an incredibly sought-after teacher, an admired colleague, and someone who continues to, in an incredibly thoughtful and incisive way, to help deal with the challenges facing this country and the world. So I pass the baton to Secretary Clinton.
Well, it's nice you're all gathered here to celebrate my anniversary. I appreciate it greatly. Thank you so much, Minoosh, and thank you for your stewardship of the university during these times, and thank you, Karen, for your leadership and partnership. And especially, I want to thank the panelists for lending their expertise and experiences to this important discussion. I'd like to thank all of you for being here and for your continued ongoing attention to the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. You know, so long as conflicts drag on, the killing, the desperate conditions of civilians in the midst of it all, that cannot be ignored, but very often the news reports move on. And with Ukraine entering its 3rd year of this brutal war, we can't turn our eyes away. We can't let the aggression by Russia and the suffering of Ukrainians go unnoticed and without response. So as academics, policymakers, global citizens, we must ensure that the world doesn't turn away from the Ukrainian struggle, and that's why we're here, to talk about the future, not just of the war in Ukraine, but equally, if not more importantly, what will happen when finally that war ends. You know, the Ukrainian government and its people are literally on the front lines of the fight to defend democracy against authoritarianism. And over the last 700 days, they have demonstrated remarkable resilience and courage. We owe it to them to match that courage and resilience with our own, to meet the moment with continued support. This is a decisive time, not just for Ukraine, but for the West, for NATO, and I would argue especially for the United States. How we respond or fail to respond will immeasurably impact the fate of the 21st century global order. It is shameful that aid to Ukraine continues to be held up in Congress because of petty politics. It is a gift to Vladimir Putin and a blow to America's global leadership and the cause of freedom and democracy. In Ukraine's tenacious fight, we see a reminder that democracy, justice, and freedom are not guaranteed to anyone. And that is one of the many reasons we must recommit ourselves to support Ukraine's struggle. Yet even as we dedicate resources to the ongoing war effort, we also must begin looking ahead to rebuilding and long-term recovery for Ukraine. It will continue to be a challenge to balance the immediate humanitarian needs and the long-term outlook. But that's one of the reasons we're gathered here, because we have an exceptional group of panelists to share their thoughts, both on the direction of the war, but also how we achieve a balance between Ukraine's present and our shared global future. So I'd like to turn this back over to the Dean, who will introduce the panelists and begin the conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Secretary Clinton, and President Mnuchin. I am now pleased to introduce our distinguished panelists, each of whom brings a unique and valuable perspective on this conflict. And so please join me on stage as I read your name. First, I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Masha Jovanovic, who has had a long and distinguished career in the Foreign Service, serving in senior positions around the world, and most recently, of course, as the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine until 2019. I'm thrilled that Ambassador Jovanovic is now also, as I mentioned, I will continue to mention, an IGP Distinguished Fellow with us today this year, and we're really lucky to have her with us. I'm also excited to have members of SIPA's brilliant faculty as part of today's discussion. Dr. Kimberly Martin is a faculty member at Columbia's Harriman Institute and its Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies. She's also a professor of political science at Barnard College and a world-renowned expert in particular for her work on Russian foreign policy and civil-military relations. Welcome, Kim. Yeah. Dr. Stephen Biddle is a professor here at SIPA, a member of the Saltzman Institute and IGP. He's one of the world's foremost experts in U.S. foreign policy and defense analysis, and he has served on several government advisory panels and analytical teams. Welcome, Dr. Biddle. And finally, we will be joined virtually by Ian Bremmer, who besides being the president and founder of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, is also an adjunct professor here at SIPA. And Ian is a best-selling author as well as a foreign affairs columnist and editor-at-large at Time magazine. Thank you for joining us, Ian. Okay. So I will now take my seat and we will get started. Is this okay? This order is okay. Okay. All right, so this panel today, the first panel, as I said, will focus on three main things. We will start with the situation on the battlefield, the military aspects of the war. We'll turn to domestic politics in Ukraine, in Russia, and the United States, and how that affect the prospects of the war. And then, of course, zooming out to talk about the geopolitical implications of what this means and what comes next. So with this in mind, Steve, I would like to start with you. As I mentioned, you are the most renowned experts on military strategies from the beginning. You've written a lot about the war and the evolution and the strategies and doctrine. Some would argue that we've entered a stalemate. And you wrote recently in Foreign Affairs that following the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive, we should expect a long war of attrition. So can you unpack for us what is the current state of play militarily?
Yeah, the war in Ukraine has been a war of position for many months, and it continues to, and it's likely to stay that way for quite some time. The initiative in that war of position was with Ukraine in the summer. It's now with Russia. Partly as a result of the culmination of Ukrainian offensive action in the summer, partly as a result of the ongoing and looming reductions in Western aid, the balance of firepower has shifted in Russia's favor. Russia, therefore, is now on the initiative and is able to conduct offensives at places like Avdiivka. I expect those offensives to be able to take some ground as Ukraine is forced to start rationing ammunition in expectations of further aid reductions. But I'd be very surprised if the Russians prove able to break through. I don't expect them to be in Kyiv anytime soon. I think this war is going to remain a war of position in which the battle lines aren't literally fixed, but in which they're unlikely to change dramatically anytime soon.
Okay. Masha, I know that you have, would you characterize the war, the state of war as stalemate at the moment?
So I don't want to take on a military expert, but I do think that it's important to also look at other factors in the war. And we focus, of course, on the land war, and it's important to note that the Ukrainians have taken back half of what the Russians took since 2022. And not only that, but they have liberated thousands of Ukrainians from Russia's genocidal occupation. That is really significant for Ukrainians and should be for us as well. So, I mean, on the land war, there are some positives to indicate. The Ukrainians, with not much of an air force, have managed to deny the Russians air superiority. That is significant. And thirdly, when you look at the naval component, the Ukrainians have basically taken back the Black Sea. They have pushed the Russians to the eastern half of the Black Sea. They have forced them to change their headquarters from Crimea to Novorossiysk in Russia. They have, I was looking today, I think they've destroyed 24 Russian battleships, and they have reopened up a commercial channel for Ukrainian shipping. These are all significant wins for Ukraine, and I think the British head of the armed forces said that this is basically the collapse of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, but I think it's important to note that there are other dimensions, as important as the land dimension certainly is. The other thing I think is important is that when we think about this war, Ukraine has been underestimated since the very beginning, since before the war started, since the very first days of the war, and continuing to today, that it just can't hold off the Russian military, and yet they continue to hang on and to actually make gains. And that is because the Ukrainians know why they are fighting. It is about their heart. It is about their families, their freedom, their future. And I think that they know why they're fighting, just like we knew why we were fighting in 1776. And when you think about our own history, I mean, that was a bodacious kind of a move that a bunch of ragtag colonists decided that they were going to take on the mighty British Empire. There was no hope for success. And yet, with the help of the French, we did win. And I think the Ukrainians can too.
And we will get to the help of friends in a moment. Staying with the battlefield, to you, Steve, one of the things which we've seen in the conversation around what's happening on the battlefield is what role technology plays, right? I mean, on the one hand, some argue that more technologically advanced weaponry, more sophisticated tanks and drones. There was a lot of discussions about unmanned drones and AI-equipped drones, that the Ukrainian military can pull out a victory. On the other hand, in your foreign affairs essay, you argued that technology can only offer so many tactical advantages, but really the key is how you deploy your forces matters. That's the most important thing. Can you unpack the debate about the role of technology here and where you stand?
Yeah, I think many people believe that Ukraine is illustrative of a revolution in warfare brought about by new technology, by drones, satellite surveillance, precision weapons. And the usual argument is that this collection of technologies is creating a new era of defense dominance, in which the kind of offensive actions that we've seen in the past will be impossible in the face of the new firepower that's causing battle lines to ossify and are making it impossible for anyone to take ground. The problem with this argument, or at least one of the several problems with this argument, is that it's not very consistent with what we've observed of facts on the ground since the war started. The actual experience of the fighting has been very heterogeneous. There have been large advances. The initial Russian advance in February of 22 took tens of thousands of square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian counteroffensive then took back an important fraction of it. The Ukrainians subsequently waged successful counteroffensives at Kharkiv and Kherson, all of it in the face of the same technology that's widely held to be making offense impossible because the modern battlefield is too lethal for people to be able to move forward and survive the exercise. I don't think that's what the experience of the war has shown. When you look at the casualty rates that the new technologies are actually producing, what you see is the ostensibly radical new firepower of the new technology is producing loss rates that are comparable to those we saw in World War II. Right? I'll give one example and then I'll stop. Right? The anti-tank lethality is kind of at the heart of much of the technological revolution argument that new drones, precision-guided weapons will make weapons like the tank obsolete. Both the Ukrainians and the Russians lost something on the order of about 50 to 80% of their pre-war tank fleets in the first year of the war. The loss rate for German armor in World War II in 1943 was 113%. In 1943, without precision weapons, satellite surveillance, and drones, the German army lost more tanks than they started the year with. Right? So the actual realized lethality on the battlefield of all this new technology isn't suggestive of some radical discontinuity with the past. It's suggestive that we're seeing a kind of a slow, linear, incremental growth of lethality over time in which real outcomes are powerfully mediated by the way the two sides use their forces. And there's been a lot of variation in that in Ukraine, which has produced a pattern of variation.
Yeah. No, thank you for this. And of course, this discussion has huge implications for policy and what we do next. Kim, I would like to move to you next. I remember from the first time we did an event on Ukraine right after the invasion, the biggest question on everybody's mind was, what are Putin's intentions in Ukraine? And you've written about this. And so 2 years later, I'm asking you again the same question. What are his intentions in Ukraine? Have they changed at all? Has he updated, as like rational actors supposed to do when there is new information? We all know better than it might not be rational actors, but what is your assessment?
Thank you, Karen, for that question. And it's so important right now because we've had some indications in December from reporting that has been done that Putin is starting to float the trial balloon of potentially having a ceasefire in Ukraine. So I think we need to talk about what that means. But in answer to your broader question, I would say that Putin has never been a strategic thinker. He's not a chess player. He's not good at looking many steps down the line, and he's not good at understanding his opponents. Instead, he is a judo master, which means that he goes goes into a situation and figures out tactically at the spur of the moment, what can he do to try to make his opponent fall from its own weight? And so I think he's been very adaptable in terms of what his goals are in Ukraine. His regime is focused on the idea of victory. It's now his whole raison d'etre, so he's going to have a victory. But I think that raises the question of, could he consider it a victory if there was some sort of ceasefire? And I think the answer is no, for two reasons. I suspect that all this floating of the idea of a ceasefire, which may come out very strongly in the interview we understand Tucker Carlson conducted with him recently, so we'll all find out soon what Putin is saying in that interview on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. I suspect that this is actually a political influence campaign that is very much geared towards what's happening in the West and in the United States, understanding that Donald Trump is attempting to force the entire Republican Party in a direction that is anti-Ukrainian, and that Putin just needs to bide his time because he believes that Donald Trump is likely to win the upcoming election, and that when that happens, NATO will fall apart, the United States will never give more aid to Ukraine, and all he has to do is wait. So I think that's part of it. But I think another thing to keep in mind, too, is that even if it's real, even if he does want a ceasefire right now, that will just give Russia time to prepare for what comes next. They'll have time to lick their wounds, to rebuild their military, and who knows if it'll just be Ukraine. I think if you're Moldova, I think if you're one of the Baltic countries like Estonia, you're very concerned that it might not just be Ukraine. And I know that in their recent meetings, NATO officials have been very concerned that perhaps Putin could even dare to attack NATO. So I'm not hopeful.
Wow. Okay. With this, so I want to talk to you next about domestic politics. So we'll talk about elections in the United States in a second. But there is, first, Russia is holding its next round of presidential elections in March. Now, skeptics and cynics might argue, and will argue, that this really doesn't matter and we should not take these elections seriously. So can we unpack this a little bit? How has the war affected Putin's domestic standing? That's, I guess, politically, that's the first one. And then related to this, how seriously should we really take these elections?
So the answer to that is that the election will be won by Putin by a wide margin. There's just no doubt about that whatsoever. But there's something really interesting that's been happening the past few weeks that I don't think people anticipated. And that is that there's this dark horse candidate whose name is Boris Nadezhdin, who started out perhaps being a Putin plant as an opposition figure, quote unquote, but who seems to have taken on a life of his own by being anti-war, anti-mobilization, anti-draft, and of working especially with the families, the wives and mothers of people who have been conscripted into fighting in Ukraine. And I think this was an unexpected turn for Putin, and we're waiting to see if Nadezhdin actually becomes a viable candidate, or if the election commission decides that he didn't get enough signatures and too many of them were faked and so he can't even run. But I think it brought to Putin's attention a anti-mobilization, anti-draft, tired of the war, tired of not having the men home view in Russian society that he might not otherwise have known about. And there's an argument that political scientists have made that the reason that elections are held in autocratic societies is in fact to bring information to the attention of leaders who might not already know about it. And so, I mean, I guess I'd turn this question back to Steve, who's the military expert, and say, if Putin decides not to have further mobilization, if Putin decides that conscription and a huge number of men deployed in the field is not the way to go, what does that mean for the ability of Putin to keep on fighting the war in the future, given what we know?
That's a great question to Steve. Steve, you want to take it?
I'd be happy to. So, under those conditions, he won't be able to fight the war the way he is fighting the war now, right? The methods Russia has been using for the last year have been labor-intensive, poor skill, high firepower. Now, with enough firepower and enough labor, you can take ground that way. They've been doing that. You can't break through that way. You can't take Kyiv that way. But that's a very high burn rate military approach. If the labor supply is cut off or capped, I would expect what the Russians will do is they'll change methods, but will continue pressure. There's labor and there's capital here. Capital is, in the case of the Russians, primarily artillery firepower. That's likely to continue to be available. The drone strikes on Ukrainian cities are likely to continue to be available. If the labor supply starts to shrink, my guess is there will be less forward pressure on the ground by infantry that's increasingly scarce, but a sustained use of firepower both against deployed Ukrainian forces in the field and against Ukrainian civilian targets in cities behind the lines. That's likely to cause less change in the battle lines, but there isn't going to be a lot of that anyway, right? If you accept the argument that at least on land this is a war position, we may not all do that, but if you accept that premise, then what would have been slow, gradual gains, changes of lines on the ground in favor of Russia will be even slower and even lesser, but the casualty rate in the Ukrainian military will continue to be very high. The suffering by Ukrainian civilians and the damage to Ukrainian civilian infrastructure will continue to be very high. It's a message of only partial optimism for Ukraine.
So a lot for us to look for different indicators politically and militarily. Masha, I want to turn to you now. Thinking about what is happening, I'm sorry, this is for?
Just for you.
Just for me.
Oh,
because you're special.
You're special. We already knew that, but now it's. Masha, for you, I want to turn to the United States for a second. And on everybody's mind is the question of the military aid package. In your mind, what are the prospects of getting the $118 billion deals through a divided Congress? And how important it is, if you can make the case, that in security assistance to changing the current realities on the battlefield?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can overstate how important our security assistance is to Ukraine, and I think we would all on this panel agree with that. It is absolutely vital. The Ukrainians are rationing what they're doing. According to the Minister of Defense, Umerov, they are being outgunned 3-to-1. I mean, I think that's a very conservative estimate, and it's hard, and it impacts on other things like recruitment, because if you don't see that you're going to be sufficiently armed, you don't want to go to the front lines, right? I mean, this is an existential moment, I think, for Ukraine. I believe that the Ukrainians can win on the battlefield with our help. But if we don't help them, they will lose in Washington, and they will lose on the battlefield as well. But that does not mean that they won't keep on fighting. It will just become a very different kind of war, and that will be on us. And so when I think about this, I mean, what are the stakes? I mean, this sends a message not only to the Ukrainians, who are worried that we are about to abandon them. It sends a message to the entire world that, you know, we are not reliable allies.
Yeah.
It sends a message to our adversaries that we are weak and that they can outweight us. And I think that, you know, when history looks back at this moment, it will say that this was a strategic failure of epic proportions that was entirely self-inflicted. So what do I think the chances are? I mean, I'm not, you know, a Washington prognosticator, although I think we all are at a certain point in this room. And, you know, I have to say, as a former diplomat, I really wonder what the messages from various embassies in Washington are back to their capitals. I think that would be fascinating, if a little bit sad. But I think that, you know, now we're looking at going back to we're looking at a plan B, that the Senate is going to put this security package for all three areas up for a vote. I mean, that used to be Plan A before it became jumbled up with border requirements. I mean, my understanding from staff and members is that the vast majority of members, both in the Senate and in the House, support aid to Ukraine. So if they vote their conviction, if they vote what they think is the most important thing right now, it should pass. The question is, given, you know, the events of the last weeks and months, will they do that?
And staying with domestic politics, let's think about the U.S. presidential election. And how is this influencing the politics, and what are the implications of a Biden or Trump win on U.S. foreign policy and the war?
Yeah. So I think that it is most likely, I think we'd all agree, that President Biden will be the Democratic candidate and that former President Trump will be the Republican candidate. I mean, things could be different, but I think that's the most likely outcome. And I think that you are absolutely right, that the Russians are counting on a former President Trump victory, and that would mean all sorts of things for us and for them, including us pulling out of NATO, you know, what it does to our assistance all around the world, including to Ukraine. It would be a very, very grim pictures of us abandoning allies and you know, providing assistance to adversaries, basically. And the important thing to remember about this is that Russia is not quietly standing by and hoping that this is going to be the outcome. Russia is actively influencing our domestic conversations about our domestic future. And I think we need to think, you know, really hard about that, and not only think hard about that, do important things to counter that very malign influence. So yeah, so I think the stakes couldn't be higher for this election. On this and on many other issues.
On many issues, for sure. Ian, thank you for being with us. Yes, I can see you here and they can see you from that screen. I want us to kind of move to bigger picture. How do you expect U.S. foreign policy then to evolve in the coming year vis-a-vis Ukraine? And not only, you know, you have the U.S. presidential election and politics, but also with the Middle East crisis and the China relationship and other emerging issues. Can you unpack this for us?
Well, sure. First of all, sorry I'm not on stage. I'm stuck in our nation's capital. I much prefer New York, but it's been great so far. And first of all, the policy has changed already. And I mean, you know, Hillary sort of mentioned this a bit at the outset, right? We want this to be a higher priority than it is right now. You know, you've got Tony Blinken in the Middle East right now for the 5th trip since October 7th. I mean, Jake Sullivan is, you know, a centralizing and dominant force strategically in the formulation and execution of U.S. foreign policy. And, you know, there is just less time that can be put into marshaling influence to drive U.S. policy on Russia-Ukraine right now. That's just a reality. And this has not been an easy policy for Biden to drive. There are a lot of moving pieces. You've got to coordinate the Europeans who are in different places on a lot of these policies, some much more assertive, some much weaker. Since October 7th, it has just gotten harder to do that. Since you lost the old Speaker of the House, in part over Ukraine aid, it's gotten a lot harder to do that. Since Trump has become the soon-to-be nominee and is putting his finger on the scale, and I agree, of course, with the ambassador that most, if they were voting their conscience, would be supporting Ukraine right now. But the full-throated loyalty of the GOP for Trump and the endorsements that are now coming every day is going to continue to make that much harder. So the policies are changing in that regard. And the ability of the Americans to get aid, the willingness of Biden to sort of shift towards, hey, maybe we need to seize the assets that we've frozen, and can we get the Europeans to move in that direction? That's a policy that's born of desperation. That's a plan B because there's concerns that they won't have the military support, and the Ukrainians are going to not only run out on the military side of what they need, but also of the support for the basic functioning of their government, which also will have knock-on effects of morale. So, I mean, there's no question that the fact that Ukraine cannot be the priority that it was is already having a very serious effect on the alliance and on the war in Ukraine.
And talking about the alliance, can you say a little bit on the European support for Ukraine? And if the U.S. support decreases, will the European powers fill the gap? And what are then the broader implications for transatlantic relations?
I think that they have made some efforts to fill the gap. You saw a much greater willingness to really put a hammer to the Hungarians and threaten Orban, say, if you don't get with the program on the 50 billion package, we are going to destroy your economy. Right. And that made Orban back down without having a nominal veto every year going forward. I kind of wish the Europeans would have had that strength 6 months ago, but it came in part because they're worried the Americans just aren't there. And, you know, some of what Trump and his proxies have been saying is not that he doesn't want to support Ukraine, depends on who you talk to.
Right.
Some is that it's fine, but the Europeans need to do more. So that statement also, I think, helps to make a difference. But to be clear, the Europeans are panicked. At Davos this year, just a few weeks ago, it was very evident. The Iowa caucuses were the first day of the summit, and everyone said, my God, Trump could easily win, and if he does, we're in trouble. What does that mean? Well, if Trump views Zelensky as a political adversary, as someone who refused to do Trump's bidding in opening investigations into Biden and his son, when it was really important to Trump, when he demanded it of him, then, you know, he's going to want to punish this guy. And one way to punish him is say, you've got to accept the lines, the territorial lines as they stand for a ceasefire. And if you don't, we're cutting you off. I think that's certainly Trump's instinct. And if that happens, it's not about the U.S. leaving NATO. I think Ivo Daalder did a great piece on this, the recent U.S. ambassador. It's more about the level of commitment of the United States, the soft but real commitment and the legitimacy of that, and that you'll have the Poles and the Baltics and the Nordics that will be incredibly opposed to Trump's policy, but Orban will not. Perhaps Fico in Slovakia will not. And also keep in mind, growing populist movements, Eurosceptic movements, that will probably have a larger percentage of support after upcoming European parliamentary elections in countries like France and Germany, are going to likely align themselves with Trump. So I fear that we've seen peak NATO and peak transatlanticism in the last year. And Trump having the nomination is changing that, as will be very, very soon. And if Trump becomes president, which is surely at least a coin flip at this point, will drive that to a much greater degree.
Thank you, Ian. Let's talk a little bit about who else is observing what's happening in this war. And we have Xi in China looking at what is happening, the state of the battlefield. What are the inferences that he's drawing from all of this, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of people out there that want to make the argument that if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, however you define success, and you know, you've heard from Steve already that we're not talking about Kiev falling tomorrow. And I wish that we could all bring Steve with us to all of these meetings, just carry him around or clone him, because he's very valuable on this stuff. Because it would help to reduce the alarmism that also you hear a lot of the Chinese are about to take over Taiwan. That's just not true. Right. And it's not true having very little to do with the dynamics between Russia and Ukraine. China's in serious trouble right now. They're in serious trouble economically. It's structural. It's long-term. They're also in serious trouble geopolitically. I mean, even New Zealand is now saying we want to join AUKUS. Indonesia has just raised their levels of relations with Japan and the U.S. to the same as the United States. The Philippines are offering the Americans 8 military bases. The U.S. most important success under Biden geopolitically was in brokering South Korea, Japan, which is now a trilateral relationship of very deep and regular engagement. And China worries about that. Of course, you've got the Quad as well. So everywhere China's looking in their own backyard, things have gone very, very badly. And that has made them want to reach out more and engage with these countries. And they're trying to turn around the lack of foreign direct investment. So they are very, very far from, irrespective of how Russia-Ukraine goes, from wanting to suddenly throw their lot in and say, now is the time to invade Taiwan. Also, I mean, the Russians, the Iranians, the North Koreans, these are chaos agents. These are actors that benefit from the world being on fire, from geopolitical vacuums. The Chinese are not that way at all. I mean, they're more than happy to see have the Americans get their nose bloodied occasionally, and they engage in espionage in the U.S., and we engage in espionage against the Chinese. We hear all of that. But China needs a functional global economy. They need the Red Sea to be open. They don't want the Russia-Ukraine war to go on ad infinitum. And when the Americans read them the Riot Act, they were much more cautious. about what kind of sort of dual use exports that could be useful for the military they were willing to provide the Russians. I'd also mention that when Kim Jong-un showed up in Vladivostok, Chinese weren't aware of that until he was making the trip, and they were pretty upset that neither the Russians nor the North Koreans sort of gave them the readout there. So I don't see China certainly is much more aligned with the Russian perspective on the war than the Ukrainian perspective. But I wouldn't call them a functional ally of the Russians here, and I certainly wouldn't say that Taiwan's about to fall if the Americans don't get Ukraine right.
Thank you, Anne. Anyone 2 fingers on any of this before we go on? No? Okay. So now I want to put out some questions, and whoever wants to can jump in. Thinking about what's coming, NATO's membership for Ukraine, NATO's 75th anniversary is coming up in July. Some commentary was about whether and are there condition or a scenario where Ukraine joins NATO? What are the prospects? What are the considerations, if you can unpack for our audience? Anyone wants to take this? Masha, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I can see 3 faces looking at me. I am a proponent of NATO membership for Ukraine, which still remains a controversial issue here in the United States. So I'll take you back to July of 23, when there was a summit in Lithuania, and all of the NATO allies were in favor of offering a membership to Ukraine, except for Germany and the US. And so NATO, as you know, is an organization that comes to decisions by consensus, and so that did not happen. What did happen is the G7 put out this idea of bilateral security guarantee agreements that Ukraine would negotiate with each country, and these are coming to fruition now. So we just saw Prime Minister Rishi sign one with the Ukrainians a couple of weeks ago. I think the Germans have as well. I think the French are on their way. We are not, because we are stuck on the hill, because we don't know how much money we might have and what we could actually provide the Ukrainians. But there are a number of countries that are moving forward with this. That is important. But moving forward, this administration, the Biden administration, has an opportunity to make history July of this year, when NATO celebrates its 75th anniversary of keeping the world more free, more prosperous, more secure for the last 75 plus years. And by inviting Ukraine to start accession talks. Now, there's a wonkiness to some of the language, which is this is not inviting Ukraine to join NATO, which I don't think is on the table at this moment, but inviting Ukraine to start accession talks puts them on the right path, sends I think, a reassuring message to Ukraine that it is a part of Europe, that ultimately it will get the security guarantees that it needs, that I think we need to provide Ukraine, and it sends a message to Russia as well. So I'm hoping that that's where we go. And I would just, for those of you who might still be skeptics of why it's a good idea to have Ukraine in NATO, I mean, this provides Ukraine with the security assurances, guarantees that it needs, and deters Russia. Because at the end of the day, when this war is finished, when whatever the peace is the peace, however imperfect or perfect, Ukraine and Russia are still neighbors. They still share that same geographical space. They somehow have to come to some understanding of what that means and what it means for the future. And if you think about it from our point of view, if Ukraine is just out there as a free radical, what does that mean for the future? Because Ukraine's going to keep on arming up, right? Because it doesn't want the same thing to happen yet again. Because we think about, well, yeah, it happened in 22, it happened in 2014. It's been happening for centuries that Russia attacks Ukraine. And so Ukraine wants to say never again, and it will keep on rearming, causing an instability on NATO's eastern flank, one that we need to think about, and one that we may need to get involved in even more so than we have now. So these are some of the arguments for why it would be a good idea to bring Ukraine into NATO.
Yes. Please, Kim.
Yeah, I just want to add to that the argument that used to be in place about why it would be dangerous to offer NATO membership to Ukraine has essentially flown out the window. It was, oh, what would Russia do in the situation that NATO invited Ukraine to join? And I think the general sensibility is Russia is doing everything that it's going to do, and if Russia decides to take further action in one direction or another, it's going to have very little to do with whether or not NATO is officially allied with Ukraine or whether there is just Western military support for Ukraine going forward. And I have written a great deal on the argument that NATO enlargement never was a military threat to Russia, that what it really was doing was emphasizing to Russia that it had lost the influence in the world that it had previously. But that's a very different argument than saying that NATO enlargement has been a threat to Russia. And Russia has essentially caused more NATO enlargement by causing Finland and Sweden to wish to join.
Yeah, and if I could, thank you. If I could just add that Russia has pulled its forces from every place else, like Sweden, Finland, every place else, poured them all into the fight against Ukraine. That does not say to me that Russia is worried about NATO.
Ian, do you want to jump in? Yeah.
Well, it also, I agree with all of that. It also does not suggest that if the Russians are able to maintain their position in Ukraine and or even expand on it, that they're suddenly going to attack a NATO country, right? And they've been very careful not to engage with NATO. I mean, you'll remember when there were those couple of Polish villagers that were killed, and it turned out that it was Ukrainian missile defense that fell. But the Russians were immediate in saying, no, that wasn't us, and here's a photograph. And I mean, if they wanted to show off that, hey, if you guys are going to provide weapons and you're fighting a proxy war against us, maybe we will hit you. That's exactly not what they did. So we hear from Zelensky, we hear from some of the sharpest advocates for stronger Ukrainian aid. You've got to provide it, because otherwise we're going to be fighting against the Ukrainians as NATO. That's not really plausible, at least not in my view, and you've heard from the panel just now why.
Yeah. Okay, so unfortunately we have time for one last question, and I want to close with, we hear discussions from some, as I said in the opening remarks, about this war cannot be decided on the battlefield. We should think about diplomacy, we should think about negotiations. What do you think, how should we think about the role of diplomacy in this war? Steve, if I can take from all of you very quickly. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the war will have to end diplomatically, because it's inconceivable that Ukraine could destroy the capacity of Russia to wage war. If Russia believes that it's still in its political interest to wage war, they'll wage war. The only way the shooting can stop is for both Russia and Ukraine to decide that some set of terms are in their mutual self-interest. That's going to require diplomacy. It will probably require security guarantees for Ukraine, whether it's NATO or whether it's something else. There's no way to end this war through the use of military instruments alone.
Thank you. Kim?
I think it's going to depend on whether Putin is still in power. I don't think Putin will give up. I take very seriously the argument that has been made by Andrea Kendall-Taylor and Erica France, that even if you have a leadership change in an authoritarian state that's in the midst of war, they often keep on fighting. But I do think that this new indication of the Russian population not supporting the war actually, quite as much as Putin has portrayed it as being, does give space for the possibility that if Putin should die, and he will die of natural causes sooner or later, that he's not immortal, that at that point, that might be the place at which the fighting finally stops, if there are Russians who come to the realization that continued fighting is not actually in Russian national interests.
Masha?
Yeah, so there actually is diplomacy going on now. I mean, that's how this latest tranche of prisoners of war were exchanged with the Russians. So there are some quiet talks going on. I mean, I think that's the first thing to understand. The second thing is that I completely agree that this, wars do end. Most of them end with negotiation, and that is likely what is going to happen here as well. And it is crucially important. I mean, Russia wants this to be a negotiation between Russia and the United States. It is crucially important that this is a negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, when I was ambassador in Ukraine, we used to talk about how, if you're if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and that is very true in these kinds of negotiations. And so I think, I think we will come to that point, but it's going to be a while.
Ian?
We're going to have to redefine what's meant as victory. It is crucially unfair that Ukraine is going to be partitioned in some way, and yet it's going to be partitioned in some way, almost certainly. That doesn't seem reasonable. We have to provide Ukraine meaningful wins in other ways, security guarantees that ensures that the rest of their territory isn't going to be taken, an ability to get into the European Union, to have a sustainable economic future that they weren't looking at before 2022 or 2014, and to have that within the context of a unified Europe, a unified NATO, a unified transatlantic relationship. None of those things are assured right now, looking ahead at our own elections and looking at the dynamics at play between the U.S. and its allies. But that is the win that we're going to have to frame. We aren't there yet. I hope we can get there.
Wow, we could have continued for another couple of hours. There's a lot to discuss. I just want to thank the panelists for really insightful and incredible conversation. Thank you so much. And stay tuned. We are going to continue with the second panel. But before that, we will take a photo.
After all this we've been trying to do. Hi, everybody. Typically one doesn't want the prior panel to, run into the panel that you're about to moderate. I actually could have listened to that for another 2 or 3 hours. So thanks to those amazing panelists. For those of us who think we study this all the time, the wisdom that they brought us about how to think about Ukraine and Russia in the future was remarkable. So we're going to try and emulate that. We're going to try and give people as much useful information. I want to introduce my panelists to you. Next to me is Timothy Snyder. He is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He's also a key voice in this country and around the world about the inherent struggles for democracy. And there's a remarkable overlap between what we just heard on the panel about Ukraine's struggle for democracy and a struggle for democracy to maintain and protect democracy here in the United States. Erwin Redlener is an adjunct senior research scholar and IGP-affiliated faculty at Columbia SIPA. He's the co-founder of the very important Ukraine Children's Action Project and the founding director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia. Erwin and I have over the years had intense, long conversations, at first about Syria and the dangers that we're facing, particularly children, in that catastrophe. And then, of course, when COVID happened, Erwin was an important policymaker on that front, and now he and his wife Karen have become very, very involved in helping children in Ukraine. Jeffrey Schlegelmilch. Good to see you, Jeffrey. He's an adjunct associate professor of climate at the Columbia Climate School and the director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia. A remarkably important institution that we have come to rely on for your work and your research over the years. So thank you for being here. And our very special guest today is Yevhen Kudriavets. He's the first Deputy Minister of Education and Science in Ukraine. Thank you for coming here. I know you've got lots to do back home, but it does help us to have your perspective live with us today. So thank you to all my panelists. Erwin, I'm going to start with you because I wouldn't mind setting out in broad strokes. When we talk about Ukrainian recovery, we mean several things. One is recovery to a point that they were at before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then there's the recovery of people and sentiment and economy and some of the things we talked about on the last panel. So give me a broad sense of what you think we need to be thinking about when discussing recovery in Ukraine. This is all on the assumption that there is some resolution to this war and Ukraine gets to go on as an independent country.
Well, eventually there will be, and there will be the need to really be thinking about recovery. And one of the points that we've been thinking about is how important it is to start thinking about recovery actually right now. In fact, President Zelensky and many of his senior officials in his government, Ukraine, were actually less than 5 months after the invasion happened, were in Europe talking to European allies about what recovery is going to take. You know, of all the aspects of disaster planning and response and preparedness, really the most troublesome, the most difficult, and Jeff's going to say something about this, is the recovery. We're lousy at recovery. We're lousy at it. And, you know, looking around the world at major disasters, we see the remnants of bad planning, insufficient resources, and so on. The recovery of Ukraine in particular is going to be it's going to be expensive, clearly. It's also going to be very complicated. It's like assembling the pieces in a four-dimensional puzzle here. A lot of things have to happen simultaneously. It's not a menu. Well, maybe we'll just do the economy and we won't do demining, or we can't do that. Unfortunately, it's going to require, one of the reasons we wanted to meet about this, is some kind of international brain trust in governments, out of governments, led by Ukraine, that will be planning for what is supposed to happen when this war finally comes to an end. There's three simmering issues that no matter what we do specifically, that we're going to need to be aware of. First of all, Ukraine has been severely traumatized psychologically. There's grieving from one end of Ukraine to the other. There's been an enormous number of casualties. Some people say 150,000, maybe more, people that have been injured, people that have been killed, mostly in the military, but also civilians. You know, and they say from previous disaster studies and trauma studies that for every person who dies, there are 9 people grieving. So you want to do that math, and it really represents an awesome problem that's going to have to be dealt with one way or another. The second thing, and I think Yevhen's going to maybe get into this a little bit, is the diaspora. A lot of people left Ukraine, including 2/3 of Ukraine's child population left Ukraine. And they're going to have to come back. Ukraine needs them. The U.S. has 25% of its population are children. In Ukraine, it was only about 17 or 18% before the war. We're going to need them. They need to come home, and that's a big challenge. And the third thing, of course, is about 650,000 mines that have been planted in places that are going to have to be cleared before we even get on to the next steps. And just quickly to mention, the next steps are going to be the built environment. How are we going to, and who's going to be responsible for rebuilding the structures, the infrastructure, the housing, and everything else that's been destroyed in this devastating war? And the second thing is, of course, the economy, all aspects of the economy, agriculture, technology, everything you can think of is going to need a boost, although the Ukrainians are doing surprisingly well in sustaining a lot of that. And then the third thing might be the military rebuilding that's going to happen. And the fourth thing is cultural, arts institutions. All of these things are going to have to be part of this big puzzle that's going to have to be assembled. And the final thing I would say, and one of the things that's really been important to Karen and me, is the restoration of normalcy for the people of Ukraine. They have to be able to go back to communities where life as it used to exist, like it exists in every other civilized corner of the world, can take place. Children have to be able to go to school, have fun, hang out with their pals, and there has to be sufficient income for their families, etc. These are the intangibles that will really define how well recovery goes. I've called really children the bellwethers of recovery. My opinion is that if the world is better for children, it's going to be better for the rest of society. I don't think you can reestablish normalcy in a community without all those elements of normalcy, specifically for children. And I guess the secret weapon for Ukraine, the big asset, is Ukrainians, the population of Ukraine. These are extraordinarily resourceful, smart, advanced individuals with a phenomenal culture and life and capacity. And I think at the end of the day, that reality is going to make recovery feasible in Ukraine when the war ends.
Erwin, thank you for that. Deputy Minister, let's continue along that vein. In the early days of the war, I was first in Budapest at a train station, and it was women and children getting off of those trains. A week later, I was in Warsaw, where I interviewed a 15-year-old girl at the time who was crying. She just wanted to go back. She said, I want to rebuild my country. And she thought, look, if I have to go to the West to get an education, I want to be able to do that, but I want to go back to my country. This desperation of these kids and these families to go back, this is a struggle for Ukraine, because now there have been, in some cases, men separated from their wives and children, or their daughters or their mothers, for coming up to 2 years.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express that this kind of events and organized by institute and by universities and generally like think tanks are highly important right now. And what you are doing in this panel and previous panel is highly timely right now for Ukraine and for Ukrainian community and Ukrainian society. And I think that it's important to discuss all in once about the current situation and what's going to be in the future. And especially for recovery, especially for kids, and for the future of education, of human capital development in Ukraine, etc. Actually, the numbers are very hard to explain. And when we are speaking about kids, and we are speaking about schools, all of these numbers are in millions. Like 5 million Ukrainians are fled in Europe, 5 million Ukrainians around have been displaced internally. It's a challenge as well when you completely change your status in your country, even if you're not in a different country, but you need to change your school, you need to change your permanent location of living, etc. A lot of trauma, a lot of mental health issues with kids who fled Ukraine, who stayed in the regions when they had been occupied for 2 to 8 months, and they have been in education, without education at all, or without any kind of social support for 8 months, or they have been fled to different regions of Ukraine, or they have been in different countries with different challenges in that countries, like Erwin said, and all other colleagues when you interviewed them. Even if they are in safe space, like in Poland or in Germany or in France or in the US, they are suffering, they are struggling, they are missing for their homes, for their friends. And all of this, in the end, all of a sudden, they're asking, would I return back? Do I have any chance to be in my school with my teachers, with my friends? And when we are thinking about the recovery, first question on our side, how to return these parents, these families, these kids back to Ukraine, and how to rebuild. When you said that something destroyed in education, we have 3,000 educational institutions completely damaged or destroyed, and it should be recovered. But you probably heard the concept of build back better, and in education we are usually saying different concept. We are using the build back better, but on different conferences I'm saying in education we wanted to build forward better. Because we need to think how education system, how this human capital development will be designed, how we will change the system for them. Because all of this, like in some moment, like we need to be optimistic, and you know that Ukrainians are highly resilient, and we need to be in a high mood to fight and to fight back. And we are trying to find optimistic things in different ways. We will be very lucky to have 5 million of Ukrainians with different multicultural frameworks from different countries when they are going to return back to Ukraine. A lot of countries like US, Britain, France, Germany, they had a lot of migration policies, special talent programs to build multicultural communities to build economy with different approaches and identities inside one nation. And we will have the unique opportunity of million Ukrainian kids who will have the access, like in the future, they would have this access from the past they will speak at least one European Union language in addition to Ukrainian plus English. They will be easily integrated to different European communities and build businesses, do science, scientific research, etc. And our task right now in a part of recovery for human capital to work in two areas. First of all, to create the environment when they will be ready to return back. It means good preschool education, school reform, creating the opportunities for requalification. We will have 1 million veterans at least. We will have millions of adults who will not be able to join their previous occupation. They will should be retrained and get new qualification, new profession. And all of this we need to do at first. But in the second time, we need to use this opportunity for them that they will return back to Ukraine and they will help to recover and to rebuild, to restore, and all other things that we can say about recovery. Because I'm very careful about the definition recovery, because if you are going in the scientific part, as in my previous research experience, recovery means like 2-3 years after the finish of the war. Even all researchers are doing this post-war recovery research are finished in the period of 2-3 years after the war. We are speaking about decades after the war, how we should rebuild community, change values, bring new perspective to Ukrainian communities. And first of all, it's about human capital, about kids, and about development of their values and approaches in new society.
That's amazing. Thank you very much for that. Tim, I'm going to give you a twofer because I want to continue on what the Deputy Minister just said, but I want to ask you about the last panel, because I know you were paying very close attention to that and you had some thoughts.
Okay. So on the last panel, there were many moments when I was at the edge of my seat and just wanted to leap onto the stage. But there's one very narrow operational point that wasn't made, which I want to make, which is that the vast majority of Russian missiles that are hitting Ukraine now were manufactured in recent months. And the huge majority of technology in those missiles comes from the United States or other Western countries. So the sanctions model has to be enforced if we're going to stop this war. That wasn't mentioned, and it has to be mentioned because this is something that Treasury and other parts of the federal government need to be doing something about. The whole character of this war and how many Ukrainians are being killed has to do with Western technology, which we have to stop from entering Russia. I will now cease to talk about panel one.
Let's talk about the bucket of recovery that falls under politics. Okay. Ukraine is a country that has struggled to find its footing in the past with respect to embracing democracy. It's something that Ukrainians have wanted for a long time, but they've hit a lot of road bumps. In the new model, to the point that the Deputy Minister was making, Ukraine will want to build back better. Build forward better, I think is what you said. Tell me what's involved with that. The idea that Ukraine has to fix itself economically, it's got to get back its social services, it's got to get back its education, got to demine, but it's actually got to be a political system that is sustainable for decades to come.
Okay, let me try to make 3 points really briefly. The first is I want to emphasize what Erwin said about the everyday quality of recovery. When I visited a town called Yevhen, which is some of you will know is a place where under Russian occupation the entire village was kept in a kind of small concentration camp in the basement of a school building. When I was in the basement, there's a list on one side of a door frame of the people who were shot by the Russians. On the other side of the door frame, there's a list of people who died of disease or exhaustion or other causes during the occupation. That school building isn't a school anymore, right? Something else has to become the school. And I remember when leaving, this is very much to your point, when leaving the town, the gentleman who had lent me the key said, "Can you help us build a playground?" And it seems like, given all the horrible things that are going on, why would he be thinking of a playground? But it's just for this reason. Exactly. It's just for this reason. These are the things that are the essence of it. And when I was in Ukraine a couple of months ago, I was in the fall, I was visiting farms in Kherson Oblast, where the farmers had demined for themselves. They'd rigged up tractors to demine their own fields, which demonstrates incredible ingenuity, but it also demonstrates a problem where I think we need to be thinking about how American ingenuity can scale up, right? The mines have to be cleared at a rate of 10 or 100 times faster than they're being cleared. And I can't help but think if there were a contest at Worcester Polytech and MIT and Caltech, we could think of a way to do this. Okay, that's the first point, the everyday. The second point that I want to make has to do with the turnover in Ukrainian leadership. So this war hits us at a time of generational turnover in Ukraine. As you can see from, I don't want to make too much of this, but as one can see from, the demographic on this platform, the generation that's in charge in Ukraine is not one, but 2 generations younger, bless us all, than the generation that is in charge in the United States. And this means that there is a kind of opportunity because there's a natural tendency to look forward in time in a different way. The thing that I want to add to what the Vice Minister said has to do with what I think is very important. Recovery, reconstruction takes place during a war. It has to take place during a war. If someone knocks your wall down, you're going to try to rebuild it. And that is, in fact, happening in Ukraine throughout the country. And some of it is being carried out by the central state or by the oblasts or by village or town authorities. But the thing I want to add is that a lot of it is being done by small NGOs, by little organizations who are never going to get the attention of Brussels or Berlin or Washington unless we get organized. And the reason, this goes to your question about democracy, because the small NGOs in Ukraine, the little bits of civil society, are the thing which has pushed Ukraine towards democracy at every turning point. And so we want to make sure, even as we support the central state, that we're rewarding those people to keep Ukrainian democracy going, to make sure that recovery is decentralized, to reward the people who are already doing things, but also for reasons of simple effectiveness. That there are people out there who have proven they can do things already, and we need to make sure that we know who they are. So this is a kind of an appeal to USAID and to Penny Pritzker and to Brussels and to Berlin and so on, that we gather together the NGOs as well as the private sector and the central government when we think about recovery.
I just wanted to respond to Tim. The reality is that there is no recovery if it's only going to be conducted by central government. Other European capitals are certainly not from the US. It is all going to depend on the total mobilization from individuals fixing their own wall to the small NGOs. We've found that we're now supporting about a little more than 30 organizations dealing with children. They're all small organizations that are partners of ours. But the other caveat here, and Tim mentioned this word, is scale. And I think this is where we can run into trouble by over-dependence on local heroes and really talented people on the ground, and there are many, many of them. But the question is, if you have a situation where, for example, 3 million Ukrainian children need to go through a catch-up educationally. They've missed school during the war. They missed school before that because of the pandemic. We're seeing children with 3 or 4 years where school attendance has been very irregular. That's devastating. And we've worked with Randy Weingarten and the AFT to be thinking about this a lot. But we know how to remediate a kid who's behind in school or a classroom. But I'm not sure what we're supposed to do about 3 million children or whatever the number is, but it's a big number. And that's where we're also going to need ingenuity, not just in the technology areas, but in areas like education where we've never taken this on before. And I look forward to people who will come forward with the same kind of ideas and responding to challenges. Okay, we could do this for you, but we need to do it for your whole county, your whole province.
Right.
That's where the challenge is going to be.
Thank you, and hello to Randy. Nice to see you, friend. Jeff, I want to get your thoughts in general, but I want to ask you something that the Deputy Minister said, and it was about recovery, being the 2 or 3 years after a war. Ukraine needs something bigger. You are a specialist in disaster recovery, but this is This is disaster recovery, this is demining, this is healthcare, this is education, democracy, and economy all in one. What's your sense of it?
Yeah, I think, when we think about disaster recovery, the way most people look at it is a very short window. There's a very short attention span on where it's very relevant. And the way that recovery is incentivized, both politically as well as among donors, and attention from donors to provide support is also very short term, but very visible. What are the things that you can see? What are the things that can be reconstructed? And I think to a lot of points that were made, this notion of the long-term psychological recovery, the long-term rebuilding, the long-term rebuild going forward is a critical piece that is often out of the limelight, often talked about up front, and I saw everyone's heads nodding when we said, oh yeah, we're gonna need long-term mental health recovery, and that's usually the last piece that gets funded. I said that wrong. It never gets funded at the level that it should be. Yeah, and so the other piece that I'd mention too is that, I think it's a fascinating discussion around the different types of organizations, and along these lines, I'm going to spend 15 seconds and throw down some disaster theory, and I promise I won't give any more lecture. But in disaster theory, there's this observation of emergent. Russell Dines, one of the forefathers of disaster science, observed emergent organizations in disaster response. And type 1 organizations are organizations that are designed to respond. Your emergency management agency, your Red Cross, your military, civil defense, things like that. And then they gradually get further and further away, and your type 4s are completely emergent organizations. Organizations that emerge because there's an unmet need. Oftentimes, these type 3s and these type 4s, type 3s might be like your church that gets involved with sheltering and never anticipated sheltering, sort of doing something completely new, but it's an anchor of the community. And I'd say with this discussion, it's fascinating because we really need both. The scales to operate at the level of what's needed are your type 1, type 2 organizations, your large NGOs. But when it comes down to it, there's a lack of flexibility to meet local needs. And this is driven sometimes by volume, capacity, and sometimes by very simple things, which is it becomes a threat to the brand to do something very different in a high-risk situation. That can have very large consequences, and that's taken very seriously when that becomes what is kind of perpetuating who you are and your ability to bring in resources to help. So these type 3 and type 4 organizations emerge, and some of the work we've done together in Puerto Rico, as well as in Texas after Hurricane Harvey, was to really help to identify what are these organizations that are emerging because no one else is meeting this need. The problem with type 3 and type 4 organizations, they don't have the attention of Brussels, they don't have the attention of DC, and they're not set up. We helped one get their 501c3 status so that they could receive donations and become self-perpetuating. So I think we have to look at this at all levels. We need the volume of resources that would come in, as well as the grassroots support, because there are things that are simply not going to be able to be met at any level other than local, and investing in that local capacity is also a long-term investment in local infrastructure, social infrastructure.
Thank you, Jeff. Yevhen, I want to ask you, the first day I got to Eastern Europe and all these people were coming in from the Far East and the northeast of Ukraine. There were a lot of students, a lot of people from other countries, African students, Indian students who were at school in Kharkiv. Ukraine is a country, despite all the educational institutions that have been damaged or destroyed, you have a very long and rich history of universities, higher education, medical education, scientific education. That should be an advantage in the recovery. You've got the infrastructure of schools and the idea that people not only in Ukraine, but people from other parts of the world go to Ukraine to get their advanced degrees.
You're absolutely correct. We had 80,000 foreign students when full-scale invasion started in February 22. Now we have around 50,000 left in different regions, mainly in western part of Ukraine, because it was the majority of the students. They have been in Kharkiv, as you said. And they can't return back because this will be completely online education, and Kharkiv is not working in person. It's impossible because when we are speaking about recovery or military assistance or something like in the first panel we discussed about political influence of different geopolitical decisions, etc. I would like to emphasize your attention not on these general things but on the real stories. For example, if we will see one person, one kid in the line of from 0 to 100 kilometers from the active front line right now, the period of time when artillery can reach the school is less then our allies can help us to identify the threat. Like, it's impossible for this kid to get back to the school. We will take attention to this kid, and we should ask how long this kid could be online. And you will see that all world, like last year, discussed post-COVID education recovery. A lot of strategies, catch-up, accelerated learning. Like, I have visited a lot of educational world forum, and everyone is speaking about catch-up programs for post-COVID recovery. Ukrainian kids had continuously experience of COVID for 2 years, and then immediately, when war started to discuss post-COVID recovery, our kids experienced the aggression of Russia with conventional forces first time in 100 years. And it was crucial for them that we have a generation of kids who has never been to school ever, like for even one day. Because they started in 2020, and now it's 2024, and they have been to school in some regions because of 2 years of COVID and then full-scale invasion. It means that in higher education, we have the same problems as well. We need to prepare this generation for future recovery, and it means the gap in education, we will have this gap between the time when we are investing money and resources to prepare them and actual result when they can implement their knowledges and be useful. But in the same time, we have this enormous amount of NGOs and active society who are doing this recovery right now, rebuilding their own walls, etc. And in Ukraine, last year it was crucial change when we decided to start educational reforms agenda during the war, and especially in higher education, in school education, but as well in higher education, to make universities stronger and to be prepared for the future of recovery. And in the same time, how to attract additional workforce in Ukraine, how to attract students to Ukraine after the finish of this war. And this system should be prepared, aligned with European accession plans, and we need to open this market for European students, etc. We need to be prepared for this, and it could be beneficial because by our estimation we will have 5 million shortage of workforce in 5-10 years from now. It means that we need to collaborate, we need to work together, and education, higher education will be the answer for this.
So, unfortunately, so will all of your neighbors. They'll also have workforce shortages, and they're enjoying having Ukrainians in some of their countries. Tim, let me ask you about what the Deputy Minister just said about ascension to Europe. 10 years ago when this started, that's what this was about. It was certainly somewhat political, but it was an economic alliance that Ukrainians wanted to form with the European Union. In some ways, that's as important a conversation as Ambassador Yevhen talked about in terms of NATO ascension. What's your sense of integration with Europe and how that's going to go and what the headwinds are?
Well, first of all, there's been a sea change. We're going to see Ukraine join the European Union, and that's something which I wouldn't have said with confidence at any other earlier point in my life. And it's going to be not only in the interest of Ukraine, but in the interest of the European Union for all kinds of reasons: an educated workforce, access to certain resources, agriculture, also a new moral and political challenge for the European Union, which I think is very important. Their story about 1945 has worn itself out. They need another story, another challenge, and this is it. This is the challenge for this generation of Europeans. I think accession very largely takes care of, although one doesn't want to lose track of it, addresses the concern about corruption, because one can make certain parts of accession dependent upon certain actions inside the country. But then finally, the very, very important thing is that this all has to do with the politics of the future. The reason why people began to protest in Ukraine, young people in the beginning in November 2013, was that Europe for them meant the future, right? The recovery that we're talking about is a future. And when we think about taking part in this recovery, we might look back and say, well, what are the things that we as Americans feel good about in the last century? Well, the Marshall Plan. what worked out for us very well economically and in terms of every other possible calculation of our interests. Also the Marshall Plan, right? Recovery isn't just something that we are doing so that the Ukrainians have a better future. It's also something that we do so that we have a better future and across every possible dimension.
Erwin, let's pick up on that Marshall Plan concept.
Yeah.
I think many of us have crossed in from Poland into Ukraine, and you can see when you cross in, but for those fantastic Ukrainian gas stations, you have the best gas stations in the world.
Yeah, they
but
do.
You do feel like when you go in from Poland, you can see the difference in the roads and the infrastructure. There is a real opportunity for the Poles, for anybody else who was in on this fight, to say, when this is over, there's a Marshall Plan type thing coming. Let's talk about the real opportunity. There's a real return on investment if you're involved in the recovery and the rebuild.
And by the way, the Marshall Plan, we appropriated about $13.8 or $9 billion total, which is about maybe $160 billion today, but a really tiny amount that catalyzed a massive reconstruction effort in Europe after World War II. And you know, you have to look at pictures of Warsaw right after the war. It was completely flat, completely broken and destroyed, and now it's a thriving, incredible city. And the European neighbors, in the broader sense, need for Ukraine to be thriving. And as a matter of fact, Europeans and the American society and future depend on that democracy that was flourishing in Ukraine coming back. And keeping in mind that the ultimate goal here, and why really the appropriations for supporting Ukraine right now is so important, is it's a cliche. Every time Zelensky addresses the US Congress, he says, we're fighting your battle. We're here for you. We're defending against this crazy tyrant who's got the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. We're holding them off on our behalf. This is one of the things that's really irked the heck out of me. I almost slipped for a second there. But it's really irked me that Americans and American political, or the political system is, let's not even go there, but that there's no recognition of how important the sustaining of Ukraine is on all levels, from its educational system to its flourishing democracy. So I think there's a lot that we are going to need to do, and it's really on behalf of the whole world that those guys are standing and fighting on the front lines of Ukraine. And you know, every day that goes by that there's more shenanigans in Congress, you know, this is not my expertise, but it is mine to get very, very upset about. So that's, I'll accept it as that. But yeah, we have a lot to do, and it's totally worth it.
Dysfunction in Congress is nobody's expertise, but boy, there's some good people at it in Washington. Jeff, so Erwin makes the point when referring to the Marshall Plan that recovery money and time and investment is exponential. It's remarkable how well it can work. You have made the point that shortfalls in recovery are also exponential, that they're much worse than getting it wrong in the recovery. And we can use all sorts of examples, including our recovery from recessions and things like that. If you get it wrong, if you're short on the recovery, it will be decades, if ever, that you recover from that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that it's also an uneven distribution of that effect. So essentially I always give the analogy: if you look at the side of a mountain, you know where the water flows, you know where the resources tend to flow, and you know the areas that tend to be dry where the water isn't going to flow. Disaster aid carves those channels deeper unless you make a conscious effort to do it more equitably. But the other piece to it too is that there's just so much more focus on the acute response, and so much of what people are looking for is seeing buildings being built and seeing sort of signs of recovery, visible, visceral signs, things that you can take a picture of, things that you can take a video of and speak out in front of. And that window is shorter and shorter in terms of people's attention. Ukraine is in a unique position, being geopolitically very important, which is both a good thing and is a challenging thing, right? Because it's going to keep that in the eye of a lot of recovery. That being said, with that comes a lot lot of agendas, comes a lot of politics that I know need to be managed and need to be managed to ultimately benefit the interests of those directly affected. So there are trade-offs for everything. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, one of the biggest challenges is it's a long game. You're looking at decades at a time, and you're looking at intense amount of efforts towards very invisible things that if you don't recover from, put you in this perpetual downfall and actually set the stage for the next disaster as well.
You have all set the stage for remarkable conversations about this, and may we be gathering here to actually discuss what that recovery is starting to look like for your country. Deputy Minister, thank you for being here. Jeff, Erwin, Tim, really appreciate your input into this. My fantastic panel. Thank you.
So we've already had two incredible panels that covered a lot of ground, literally, on where we are in the current conflict and where we hope to go at some point in the future. But I think it's fair to say we need to begin doing much more thinking and planning about that. And on the second panel, we were fortunate to have two Columbia SIPA faculty and members who can be part of our thinking through what specific role we might be able to play, particularly in this important area of supporting people on the ground in their efforts to be both empowered and recognized as agents of recovery, reconstruction, rehabilitation, regeneration. So here at SIPA, and particularly at the Institute, we're going to be thinking about how to play an ongoing role. And any of you who are faculty or students who are interested in that, I hope you will let us know, because it's a great opportunity. At the end, we were talking about the Marshall Plan, and I think it's fair to say, as Erwin pointed out, this wasn't a lot of money in relative terms. It was a lot in 1946, 47, 48, but it paid such enormous returns, obviously not just to a rebuilt Europe, but also to the United States. And it would be very helpful, if there are those of you who have studied the Marshall Plan, to bring forth your analysis of it, because the money primarily went to private actors, not to governments. It primarily went to businesses to support, subsidize, enable them to restart businesses, to create new businesses, to get a market going. It went to local, municipal kinds of community efforts. So I think there's some creative ideas that could come out of an in-depth review of how it worked. It's also important to underscore, as our panelists did, this took a long time. You know, there were still, rationing in Europe 5-6 years after the end of the war. There was a lot of, efforts that had to be undertaken to move anywhere near normalcy. And we have such a shortened attention span in today's world. I think we need to figure out how to both convince ourselves and others that any kind of effort has to be long-term, and we have to stick with it. And in our political system, that's challenging, but we have to try to make the case for it and support everyone who's engaged. We're waiting on the ambassador, but you can imagine being the ambassador from Ukraine to the United States at such a pivotal moment in congressional consideration of whether or not there will be continuing aid. And I think Masha and others pointed out that it's likely that there will be a vote, this Plan B approach, a vote that connects Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan military assistance that will then hopefully get an up or down vote. And if they do get an up or down vote, it will pass. And that's one of the great, tragedies of what's going on politically right now, is that all of this, if border security, if, given an up or down vote without undue influence, would pass. And obviously this package for Ukraine. So I think that as we wait for the ambassador, it would be very helpful to think about the various pieces of the puzzle here at Columbia. And since we have the president, Manoush, with us, Manoush, could I hand you this microphone and maybe you could say a few words? As Manoush, as she was introduced, she has an expertise in making economies work for everybody, which seems like a good idea. So Manoush, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much. I think what I'd say is the international system is quite good at the top-down bit of reconstruction. So, if you think about other countries ranging from, think about what happened in Eastern Europe when the wall fell, and how that was organized.
We have the ambassador.
Aha! I'll save that thought.
Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us on such a busy day. You were just listening to the president of Colombia, who was carrying on the conversation we've already had from the previous two panels about what this university, particularly here at SIPA, the Institute of Global Politics, can do to be a good partner with Ukraine for a recovery, reconstruction, regeneration agenda. And as the Vice Minister of Education pointed out to us, particularly when it comes to education and to children, building forward, looking at the future. So thank you for joining us, and I appreciate your taking time from what is an incredibly busy schedule.
Well, thank you, Secretary. I'm always happy to join, especially in this great university with such an exceptional panel of experts you had today. And, it's, as we all, it was one eye looking at what happens on the Hill right now, actually, has very much related, of course, to the support of Ukraine, but I'm honored to be here.
Well, let's get into it, Ambassador. President Biden and his colleagues in Congress have been working literally for months to get an aid package for Ukraine across the finish line. I said earlier, I think it's shameful that aid to Ukraine continues to be held up in Congress because of petty politics. That's my statement, not yours. But I would welcome you to take a moment to speak directly to those who may be opposed or who are holding out on approving this aid. Why is U.S. support so critical right now?
Thank you, Secretary. Yes, and I don't know whether you have seen, but literally minutes ago, there was an alternative draft also put out publicly by the committee, which only includes the help to Ukraine, Israel, and only the international part of it. So the debates are still ongoing. And during this time, it has been a very bipartisan effort, I should say. People on both sides of the aisle have been not only working hard to provide the support, but also understanding why it is important. And it is important because it's the right thing to do, because, the values for which we are fighting now, the situation that Ukraine has found itself in is appalling to anyone who believes in these values. I mean, it's totally unjustified, totally unprovoked war. A larger autocratic nuclear power simply violated our borders in 2014 and violated them in 2022. And by violating the borders and by doing all these atrocities, and everyone, I think, now heard about the rapes and killings and, what happened in Bucha, what happens every day, actually, on the occupied territories, they also violated the order which we all thought we put together after the World War II. So essentially, it's not just about Ukraine anymore. It was never only about Ukraine. It's about whether the countries, especially countries who believe in rule of law and democracy, can feel safe. Can we all be safe in a world in which Russia's, together with North Korea, together with Iran, together with all the friends, can do horrible crimes and get away with it? Second, for American people, it's also an important thing to do as for the leaders of the free world. America has been such a beacon of democracy throughout different administrations, throughout different times. I'm eternally grateful to this country for ending the evil empire, and that I don't have to live anymore in the Soviet Union in which I spent my youth. And nobody who knows what it is don't want to spend a day in a situation and society like that. So the leadership of the U.S. is very important. And by attacking us, Russians are not only rewriting or trying to rewrite history and violating the borders, they're trying to challenge also the leadership of other great countries, including the U.S. Also, we have to know that because the world is not safe now, we all have to protect our citizens better, and U.S. has to protect American citizens better. Now, with the supplementary funding that the Congress has been so generously allocating and administration asking the Congress to do during these 2 years, we have received the goods, and we're very grateful for all the weapons. But the money stayed here, the majority of the money. It's jobs created here. It's industry that has been developed here. And unfortunately, we still have to produce weapons in order to feel safe, in order to deter others, not only Russia. So whether you look at it from, and lastly, of course, you know, the NATO argument, Putin has been very clear that it's not just about Ukraine. He also threatened other countries, including countries which are members of NATO. So we all, it would be more efficient and effective for all of us to stop it while it's still in Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting this war on our own soldiers-wise. We never asked the boots on the grounds. We never will. But if, God forbid, Putin prevails in Ukraine and move further, then it's American troops that will have to defend the NATO partners. So from any perspective you look, whether it's from the moral perspective, from, you know, national security perspective, from just, you know, the economic and other perspectives, this is the right thing to do. And look, we have done so much. When you do something and you have the results, you have to double down and get to the victory, not to change the course. This is the time to stay the course. So that's why the support now is so critical.
Well, Ambassador, that's a very strong argument. It's the right thing to do. It's a smart thing to do. It's in our interest to do it. And your personal note about having lived under the Soviet Union, I think it's especially important for our students because, you know, that seems like ancient history, but it's not. And, you know, your personal experience, and of course we know Putin famously said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the, you know, greatest catastrophe in history because an authoritarian mindset really welcomed that kind of oppression. But it's freedom that you now have, which you wouldn't have had. And it's especially important to understand that denying aid, as you said, as President Zelensky has said, is a gift to Vladimir Putin. And it goes to the point that we heard in our first panel. There's a lot about the influence operations being run out of the Kremlin aimed at discouraging Americans, undermining support for Americans. So what could you say about why this is such an inflection point for security and democracy, you know, not just for Ukraine, obviously, but Europe, the U.S., NATO, and even globally?
Let's look at where we are. So after Russia attacked us, they, of course, were not able, because of the bravery of Ukrainian people, but also because this time the world has come together. Maybe not as fast as we needed, maybe not everything that we needed, but the response from both the US and European Union and Japan and UK and all our friends and allies have been very strong. And with that support and our bravery, we were able to liberate more than 50% of what Russia has taken. We actually denied Putin what he planned to take Ukraine over 3 days or 3 weeks. But right now, you know, with all this even progresses and supports, Putin is continuing his war effort. And look what is happening. He's joined now openly by other terroristic regimes. Hamas is visiting Moscow, and Moscow is helping Hamas. Iran is providing the Shahid drones. North Korea is providing the ballistic missiles, which we now see on the ground. Like today, Kharkiv again was shelled heavily, including with the Korean missiles. So this new axis of evil, the bad people, unite together and stay strong. And the question for all of us, are we strong to stay together as democracies? You know, because all this, there are no real elections. Yes, there will be so-called elections in Russia this year, but we all know from the start who will win those elections. And similar true about other autocratic regimes. But there are all elections in all our countries. And this is what we fight also for democracy. But I think the question, and it's a litmus test for all of us, whether we can fight for democracy, be a democracy, provide the pluralism and all these discussions, and yet on main issues, which are existential for Ukraine as a nation, but existential for any democratic state, to stay together, to stay the course, and do what is necessary to prove that democracies not only deliver better to their people, I think that is indisputable. People live much better in democracies. But can democracies defend themselves from, you know, autocratic states? Because the implications of this war and the result of it is important for all of us, not only to stop Russia, but also to deter so many who are looking from the sidelines and not sometimes from the sidelines and think, you know, have we changed already the rules? So what Putin is trying to do is actually to change the rules, to change the global rules. So everything that is written in the UN statute, the territorial integrity, sovereignty, the right of people to live how they want to live, the right of people to elect who they want to elect, and change their leaders on a regular basis. To be like we in Ukraine decided that we want to be Ukrainian, we want to be European, we see ourselves in a transatlantic family. We have made the choice repeatedly since we voted for independence in 1991. So on both Maidans, we didn't fight for an individual. On both Maidans, we fought for our right to choose. On Orange Revolution, for our right to choose and for elections results not to be rigged. In 2013, for our right to choose to be European and not to allow anyone under pressure of Russia to turn away from that path. And I think this is what this is all about the right to choose. And I don't remember who said that when people have the right to choose, they always choose freedom and democracy. And this is true. Even years of Russian occupation, whether during Russian Empire time or Soviet Union, did not change the Ukrainians' craving freedom, fighting for freedom, wanted to be free. And we have, and I'm so glad, to be talking to students, because we also in Ukraine now have a full generation of people who never, unlike me, lived under occupation. They were born in Ukraine, they live in Ukraine, and they're dying now for their country on the front lines. But they're dying not only for our country, they are dying also for democratic and European values. So it's, I just came back from Kansas City, where I was yesterday in Missouri. And, there is this, my mom is from the farmers family. And there is this very strong sense in any farming community when you visit them, whether it's in Ukraine or in the United States, very similar, that when something happens in the farming community, you come to help. You don't ask whether you like each other or don't like each other, whether you talk to each other or not. That's for the peaceful times, But if something happens, you come to help. And this is the time when we all have to come to help. And I have to tell you, Ukraine, after we win and after we rebuild, with our battle-tested army, with our reformed economy and reformed system, which we will continue to reform, and we are reforming it now during the war, and as a future member of European Union and hopefully NATO, we will come to help all of our friends and allies. We will be an asset and such an important addition to the collective security and collective prosperity. But we just have to win first.
Well, I think that's a great description of, what Ukraine offers. But Ambassador, that it's oftentimes very difficult for people on the outside to know what's happening in a war. And on our first panel, we heard from professors here at Columbia, as well as the former ambassador of the U.S. to Ukraine, that Ukraine has shown great courage. You've made some advances. You've done some extraordinary offensive work, particularly on the Black Sea and elsewhere. But it also is fair to say that you're against an enemy that has a lot more resources, a lot more of a population to draw from. So what is your assessment of the conflict right now? And how do you see Ukraine making progress in that conflict? And recently we've heard Putin has talked about a ceasefire. What is your sense about what he actually means by that?
Well, you're absolutely right. You can just look at the map and compare the size of Ukraine and size of Russia, and then just Google, the number of people, the number of resources, the number of the armed forces, the number of everything. And it's very clear why some people 2 years ago made a mistake and thought that it's game over, that Ukraine will not be able to stand against the full-fledged aggression like this. And yet we are here. And, the situation right now, again, we have liberated a lot in 2022 on the land. We have made tremendous breakthroughs on the Black Sea in 2023, something that if you were to ask people, even at the beginning of summer 2023, whether it's possible, I'm positive that a number of people, including experts, would say definitely not. We were all discussing how to get Russia to comply, even with that not easy deal that they had with the UN to deliver some of the food, and they were pulling out from it. And now we're doing it on our own because our military has been able to clear the Black Sea in the majority of areas from the Black Sea Russian fleet. And then, they are much farther now. Some of the boats are not even in Crimea. But yet it's a very hot war. I mean, I know you don't see it on TV anymore, but the front line is more than 800 miles. 800 miles. It's like from Washington, where I sit now, longer than to Chicago on foot. Just imagine the magnitude of a front, and it's very much an artillery duel with, and the fight is every day. Now, on top of that, Russia continues to shell our peaceful cities indiscreetly with all the Shahid drones and missiles. Just this night, when we were sleeping, was a day in Ukraine, 64 missiles, ballistic missiles, and Shahid drones. We destroyed 44 of them. The rest, reached, unfortunately, the ground undestroyed. And only in Kyiv, we have 4 people killed in the residential area, in their apartments, and 21 wounded. And that's unfortunately similar today in so many other places, including Kharkiv, including Kherson, which has been pounded literally on a daily basis after we have liberated it. So this is a pure terroristic attacks everywhere. And yet, under the circumstances, today the parliament voted another new law on mobilization. So we're trying to do more in rotating our brave defenders, because people have been on the front lines for 2 years. We're trying to do everything that we can to produce the drones and everything else. But Madam Secretary, frankly, today is, again, a pure function of weapons. That's why this support, that's why the supplementary budget from Congress is so important, because we can be as brave as we can. We will raise and mobilize all the revenues. And it's a miracle that during the war, our economy grew 5% last year. Our national bank, together with Ministry of Finance, together with the big team Ukraine, not only curbed the inflation, which of course skyrocketed during the first year, but stabilized the situation. Now, of course, it's all very fragile. We still did not win. We still do not have enough air defense, and we have to sustain the effort on the front line all the time. But with the support, and that this draft package has about 60 billion worth of support to Ukraine, primarily military. 50 billion is in the military and 10 in direct budget, energy, and other. This is very important to have it now. But in addition to that, we're not only doing that. We also work on justice. The Prosecutor General Office is literally also, as we speak, investigates the cases. We have now, more than 120,000 cases which are already been investigated. We're working hard to get the children back, another horrible crime for which Putin is indicted as a war criminal already, and more and more and more. And we also are working on diplomatic solutions, which again, so that while, of course, we need more weapons, more support to Ukraine, to defend on the battlefield and everywhere. We need more sanctions and isolation to Russia. But at the same time, almost 80 countries and organizations took place in the last meeting of the peace formula by President Zelensky. And that's our diplomatic effort, based on the UN resolution, based on UN rules, based on UN charter, of getting people together and saying, look, nobody wants peace more than Ukraine. This is true. We have to fight because we have to fight. But at the same time, while we are fighting to get the enemy out, we are working on this solution. And that comes back to the ceasefire or so-called ceasefire proposal. Well, first of all, all that is very false narratives from Putin and his clique. This is his war of choice. If he wants to stop this war, it can be done within literally hours. He gives an order to stop the war, get out from Ukraine. This is the end of the war. And then we can negotiate and decide and on reparations, on justice, on everything else. But we never intended to attack Russia. We still do not intend to attack Russia. All we want for them is to stop the aggression and get out. So he can do that. He doesn't need a ceasefire in order to stop the war. He might need an operational pause because he's running out from time to time of missiles. That's why, pathetically, he has to go to countries like Iran and North Korea and ask for this. But that only gives us, I think, a task for all of us to work better on sanctions and isolation so that we can deny him the right to and an opportunity to have this war. So it's the ceasefire idea is only to provide operational pause for Putin if he needs it, but also to decrease the support of the friends and allies. You know, to spread this propaganda and false information that he would like a ceasefire and stuff like that. So we just have to, I think, you know, sometimes in international relations, international affairs, things are complicated. You know, yes, there are different complicated concepts and you have to study them, and it's not that simple, you know, but this is a very black and white type of case. This is very simple. I think this is where we just have to take it at face value, look at it, see it the way it is, and just act accordingly.
Well, you could not be more right in describing what is behind Putin's discussion of a ceasefire. And I think it's also important, Ambassador, to touch on, before we let you go, because I know how busy your schedule must be with everything going on the Hill and the hope that we get a vote on this new package that is going to be presented. But what advice would you have for Americans, particularly those of us who are strong supporters of Ukraine, who are interested in Ukraine's future, who are interested in Ukraine's recovery? We're not part of government. We want to be helpful. What could you advise us? Because we want to keep building from these two extraordinary panels we have. We have panelists who have a lot of expertise in recovery, panelists who've been to Ukraine many, many times during the war. To close out our conversation, what could we do that would be helpful right now and going forward to help Ukraine as it begins to, work on a recovery and rebuilding for the future?
Thank you very much, Secretary. First of all, thank you for everything you do. And from the humanitarian support to other very important, we really appreciate all your help and support. There is a lot Americans can do, actually, still. And, it's from contacting the congressmen and senators and making the position known, because people who do support, they do so much, but they rarely start their day with saying, "Oh, we still support Ukraine." People who don't support say it. And what I learned, we have to inform people. We have to, even if it's just talking to your neighbors, but making your position public is very important, because I think the majority of people, and when I travel throughout the United States, I see it on a very strong bipartisan basis. The majority of people still very much support Ukraine. And we have to say it. That also creates the sense of community and allows us to do more together. Second, get involved in reconstruction and rebuilding, because it's happening now. Yes, we're preparing for the future, big leapfrogging into that's going to happen after we win. But the rapid recovery, the preparation for it happens already now. And there is so much everyone can do there, from expertise to architectural designs to just expert panels. I mean, there is a lot to do there, and we really would welcome participation of the Americans there. Reach out to your counterparts in Ukraine. And if you don't have counterparts, reach out to the embassy. We would be happy to put you in contact with either schools or local communities or cities. If your city does not have a sister cities program with Ukraine, reach out to us. There are so many cities in Ukraine who are looking now for the sister cities in the US. And it's not because it's not about money. It's about talking to someone, getting the expertise, sharing, and just talking together. Who would like to travel to Ukraine? We would be more than happy to organize these visits to Ukraine. Yes, it's a country in war, but when you go there and see it with your own eyes, you also will see how resilient Ukrainians are and how we are rebuilding and doing everything and working and trying to create a better country for us, even during these horrible times. So everything from humanitarian to cultural, read a Ukrainian book, listen to Ukrainian song, let's do something together, discover Ukrainian ballet for you. I mean, there is so much we can do together because frankly, Ukrainians and Americans are so much alike. I mean, I know people usually compare us to some European nations because we are neighbors and it's closer, but this love to freedom and entrepreneurship and innovation, when I think about it, I think that Ukrainians are very much similar to Americans in that. And I remember, great Senator McCain, who I knew personally, who I met actually in Kyiv, Ukraine. One of his famous phrases was that Americans never quit. We do not hide from history, we make history. Well, Ukrainians are making history today. We are making history today with Americans. And we can really make a history. But whether it's on the personal level or the institution level, there is so much more we can do. Not only to win this war, but to win the peace after we win this war.
Well, I think that's a great opportunity and a bit of a challenge to all of us that we will take up with you. Let's get through Congress and get the money appropriated and make sure that Ukraine has the material it needs to continue this fight. And then we also want to be engaged with you going forward. So, Ambassador, thank you so much for taking time out of this very busy day to be with us. We're greatly appreciative. Thank you.
And big thank you to Columbia University.
Well, right before we leave, I want Manoush to finish saying what she was going to say. Because she, I love calling people Madam President. So.
And I always reply to Hillary, I wish I could reply and do the same. Just to finish that thought, I mean, I think that, when one turns one's mind to recovery and reconstruction, there's sort of three levels to think about. The first level is the European machinery. If accession is inevitable, as Tim Snyder said earlier, the European Union has this machine that was the most powerful machine for integration of Central and Eastern Europe. And it will provide support to Ukraine on everything from monetary policy to fiscal policy to food standards to how you run your elections. And that machine will kick in, and it will take time, just like it did with Central and Eastern Europe. But that bit of the recovery and reconstruction effort will be done by the European Union. And I think we can count on that to work pretty well. It's worked pretty well with all the other countries. The second level is the kind of physical reconstruction, the sort of more Marshall Plan-y bit. And from my experience in other parts of the world, when you have that situation, everyone piles in a somewhat chaotic way. And you have huge issues around coordination of everyone who wants to pile in. In the Ukraine case, the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and many others will pile in to mainly do the heavy infrastructure reconstruction, which is so needed in all those destroyed cities in Ukraine. But there's a third level of reconstruction and recovery, which was hinted at in the previous panel, the normalcy, the level 3 and 4, I think was referred to, the civil society, the rebuilding the institutions of society, where those top-down institutions are not very good at. And I wonder whether universities and civil society could begin to think about how to build those connections with Ukraine. They were vital in Central and Eastern Europe, and I think they will be vital in Ukraine. And I can see Tim Snyder sitting at the edge of his seat, wanting to say something. Shall I pass the baton to him?
Well, thank you, Manoush. I just wanted to say that, well, first of all, thank you for being a university president. It's a thankless job. But It sounded like what you just said was that Colombia and SIPA would be interested in cooperating with a consortium of Ukrainian universities to create a list of functioning NGOs in Ukraine that might serve as these bottom-up partners in a future reconstruction effort. If you'd like to have a conversation along those lines, I have an idea how it could proceed, because I think you're 100% right.
We accept. and this is a handshake. Memorandum of understanding to come. But you know, seriously, when we planned these two panels, and then of course opportunity to talk to the ambassador, what we hoped is that we would come up with ideas that we then could build on. And you know, we have the disaster prep, organization right here. We've got faculty members, we've got interested students. So yeah, we'd even think of cooperating with Yale under the right circumstances, Tim. But I think before we break up and you all go, I just want to say a word of personal gratitude to Tim. You know, his outspoken advocacy for Ukraine, based on his very deep understanding of the history of Europe, Ukraine, Russia particularly, has been such a clarion call to moral understanding of what this is really about. And I just personally, on behalf of, myself, SIPA, our dean, Columbia, our president, really thank you, because you've shown what the deep academic expertise you have can actually mean when applied to understanding what's going on right now in the world. And that's a great example for all of us. So thank you very much. Thank you all.